Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening, and welcome to the Third Bridge Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Segovich, recording from our London office. In each episode of our podcast, we hope to explore the minds of some of the world's most innovative founders. But trust me, this isn't going to be a podcast where we provide tips from successful entrepreneurs. Honestly, there are lots of great podcasts that do that. But what we're doing is taking a unique approach to these conversations. As a company, Third Bridge believes that those human insights, that's the knowledge that's based on your own experiences or those learned from others, are the most powerful tool to gaining an investment advantage. Frankly, it's why our investor clients choose us when they're looking to generate better returns. What we've also seen, beyond our own business, is that founders of businesses all over the world can trace their own business success to human insights. Whether it's the lessons learned from their own experiences or the information shared by an inspiring mentor, or those dozens of no's that they hear from investors before finally getting to that critical yes. And that's the information we, frankly, find to be the most interesting and engaging as well. It makes for great storytelling, so we thought, why not have a podcast where we can dig into those and have conversations with these really innovative founders about those human insights and how they drove success for their own businesses. So actually, we hope you have as much fun listening to these conversations as we enjoyed having them. Thanks for joining us. Great. Well, thanks again to our listeners for joining us. We're really excited to have our guest on today. Before I introduce him, this is a company that is actually doing some really interesting things. And they've been covered in the New York Times, they've been in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, they've been in Wired, they've been in TechCrunch, The Guardian, they've been all over the place. Frankly, whoever's doing their public relations is doing a great job because these guys are definitely getting quite a bit of ink in the market. So if you haven't heard of them yet, you will be. And the company is called Ollie, and I've got their co-founder, Chris Bledsoe, joining us. Chris, thanks for joining the podcast.
Hey there, Jeff. Thanks for having us on.
Great. Yeah, no, it's exciting to have you guys on. Like I mentioned, you guys are doing some really interesting things, and we'll get into Ollie and what you do and kind of, what market you're in. But before we get into that, Chris, why don't you kick off by telling our listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure thing. So I grew up in a very suburban neighborhood in South Florida, so kind of wedged between Miami and Fort Lauderdale.
Right.
And was part of a close-knit family and had a couple siblings, a brother and sister. And my brother and I spent pretty much all our time together as kids growing up. And that certainly has influenced the way that we approach things today and influenced our decision, in fact, to go into business together. I grew up in Florida, went to school for university at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and graduated in the class of 2003, moved to New York immediately after that. And I had studied marketing and new and small business management, which was the closest major the university had to entrepreneurship at the time. Since then, they've built out a very robust entrepreneurship program, which I'm happy about. And ultimately, though, decided not to go the entrepreneurial route right out of college. In fact, got some advice from my father, and my brother and I were both considering doing something more entrepreneurial. And the advice was, right out of college, you want to take the safe route. And so it was that my brother ended up at Bear Stearns, and I ended up at Lehman Brothers.
I love that. It's just the irony of the quote unquote safe route. And obviously, we know you didn't end up at Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, but I do love that story. Is that would have been the the quote unquote stable and safe route, and obviously it ended up quite the opposite.
Yeah, it really shaped the way that we perceived risk and risk taking in our career, and ultimately we had, once you're bitten by that entrepreneurial bug, it doesn't go away. You're infected for life, and so even while we were in finance, we were both very focused on looking at pain points around us and thinking about creative solutions and identifying those pain points as opportunities to create something more entrepreneurial and a solution that could solve the pain point. So it wasn't too much of a stretch then when my brother had an experience that was fairly typical coming to New York City and needing to make ends meet, and he took a pressure wall and he put it up in the living room of one-bedroom apartment, that at the time he wasn't in a position to be able to afford. And he turned the living room into 2 additional bedrooms. He put them onto Craigslist. He got 90 responses in 2 days' time.
Wow.
And for us, that was the aha moment. We didn't immediately leave our jobs. That wouldn't come until about 5 years later. And there was a lot of work in between then and leaving our jobs. But it was the genesis for the business that would go on to become Ollie and the notion of co-living or communal living.
Yeah, no, I think most of our listeners will definitely be familiar with the concept of co-working. Co-living is obviously a category that's still growing and developing, and there's probably a little bit less consumer understanding of that business model. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit? I mean, obviously you gave them a good flavor of how you found out that was a pain point, especially in big urban environments like New York City. But what is the what does Ollie do? What's the gap in the market? What's the problem you guys are trying to solve?
Yeah, so we're taking the approach that a consumer product company might take to its category. It just so happens that this consumer category is housing, as opposed to cereal or ketchup or whatever else you might think of. But for us, we looked at housing and we thought, well, there's a lot of pain points there, and as a consumer category, we're spending more money on housing than we are on anything else, yet we have very few options at the price points that many consumers would need in order to qualify for the official housing market. And so a lot of consumers, like my brother, had been pushed into this underground housing market that transacts on sites like Craigslist, and where pressure walls are being used to essentially bend the housing stock itself to densify to meet their needs. So co-living is a little bit of a kissing cousin, if you will, to co-working. Co-working, the notion there and why the business model works is it's a densification of desks on a floor plate. So you're getting more people onto a floor plate in an office space, as opposed to these more spacious offices. You've got communal desks and hot desks and that sort of thing for the co-working world. Co-living world, it's about densification of bedrooms. And the idea is, by densifying, you can push the price point down to the consumer, so it's a lower price point for the consumer, but at the same time, you can deliver better efficiencies, better yields, better utilization and optimization for the asset itself. So all of that translating to a higher dollar per square foot revenue. For us, it was pretty accidental that we stumbled into this opportunity. When my brother got the 90 responses to his Craigslist listing, he decided to take it down because he didn't want to go through 90 different candidates to figure out who he wanted to roommate with. So in taking the listing down, he put it back up at a higher price. And he ended up doing that a couple more times before really narrowing down the list of potential roommates to something he was willing to sift through. When all was said and done, although he was paying his landlord $2,800 a month, he had turned this one bedroom into a 3-bedroom apartment. Each of his roommates ended up paying $1,400.
Wow.
So he was living entirely for free, which was pretty remarkable for him to be able to live for free in the most expensive city in the U.S. at the time. But everything else about that process was broken. And co-living was the answer to this, underground housing market, and creating a more institutional, purposeful solution to all the pain points that emerged from his experience, whether that be roommate compatibility or the fact that it was, 3 roommates living together, sharing a space that was only meant for 1 or 2 people, so they only had 1 bathroom. The notion that there were these makeshift bedrooms that didn't have air conditioning or the proper ventilation. those were things that we knew we could solve, and the economic model was there to do it, because if you looked at the fact that he was living for free, or you valued his room at least $1,400 a month, which is what the other two rooms were renting for, the landlord could have been generating in that space $4,200 a month instead of $2,800. And with that incremental revenue, there'd be a significant opportunity to reinvest to solve all the other pain points.
Really interesting. So, obviously you've identified a pain point through this insight that you've gotten, that your brother came across from his own personal experience. So, pain point, you've got a plan in place of how you might start to address this, but obviously it wasn't as easy as just a turnkey type of launch. You guys obviously had money that needed to be raised. You had property needs. There's housing and zoning codes and things like that obviously are kind of an umbrella over this concept. So what was next? How did you get from idea to launch?
Yeah, it was a long, arduous process to go from the aha moment to where we are today. It started with a recognition that there probably wasn't something totally code compliant about what he was doing in his apartment. So the idea of putting a pressure wall up and without consideration for light and air requirements, we knew that it probably wouldn't pass muster with the building code. So the first step for us was figuring out, okay, if his unit doesn't pass muster with building code, is there an alternative layout that we can come up with that is code compliant, recognizing that yes, we could probably just rent the unit next door and replicate the model there and kind of do that in a few more units. But eventually, given that there were 90 responses in 2 days to his Craigslist listing, eventually we would reach a scale where we're no longer under the radar. So turning this into a business, we knew that we were going to need to attract significant amounts of capital to build these, buildings that can house this many people. And to attract that capital, we were going to need to be totally buttoned up from a zoning and code perspective. So the first stop for us was downloading the zoning text from New York City Department of Buildings, the multiple dwelling law, engaging architects, zoning land use council, just getting smart about what we could feasibly do code compliantly. That path led us to the Department of Buildings in 2010 with a request for an approval for our code compliance strategy to create density. 10 months later, we received our answer, and it was that, in fact, the approach we had come up with was indeed code compliant, and at that point we thought we were off to the races. So we left our jobs in early 2011.
Yeah.
And we had a little bit of a rude awakening. It turns out that the bottleneck to innovation in housing had not been regulatory. We just assumed that it had been regulatory.
Right.
Instead, it was the conservatism of the capital needed to bring these buildings to market.
Interesting.
So we took the next 3 years after leaving our jobs, so 3 years later, 400 meetings later, and a lot of gray hair later, we ended up with our first yes.
Wow. 400 meetings.
Right, 400 meetings. Finally, and then you think, well, you guys sound kind of insane if you expect a different outcome and you're just repeating the same thing over and over. We kept going because we kept getting the answer. We didn't get no. We got, the feedback that it was an interesting concept and they'd like to do our second building.
Yeah, they wanted it to. They wanted the trial to happen before they put the money where the mouth is, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody wanted to be the guinea pig. Somewhere along the way, we started to feel like maybe we were just getting a sense of false hope. But we had a lot of encouragement to keep going, and we had a viewpoint that there was a certain inevitability to the institutionalization of this product type. Certainly co-working, we were seeing co-working emerge onto the scene, but we were also just very convicted in our beliefs because we felt strongly from a consumer perspective that there had to be a better way to live based on, my brother's own experience.
Right.
So we kept going. And in 2014, ultimately, we got our first yes. And, well, that was a fantastic moment. It was also a recognition that first yes didn't mean we were exploding into the market at that moment. It was just a yes, we were going to bring Ollie into this project. And by the way, this project is going to take 4 years to build.
Right. Yeah. It was just one step, a pretty large step, but obviously not. There was nothing final about it for sure.
It's kind of crazy. I mean, to think the project that we just opened in 2018 was initiated at a point in time where the word co-living didn't even exist.
Right, yeah, you guys were creating a category. It wasn't even just a business. It was, you had to get buy-in that there was a category that didn't exist that you were filling a need for.
That's right.
Yeah.
And unlike a tech startup where it's a lot easier, you innovate, you put a app into the market, you listen for the consumer feedback, you make some adjustments, retool, and then put it back out. We didn't have that luxury. We needed to be really buttoned up from the start, otherwise we weren't going to be able to convince this conservative capital to take a chance on something new. And unlike a consumer product category where innovation is the lifeblood of the category, and if you don't innovate, you die, the housing market had a very different, and the real estate industry had a very different perspective at the time. It was innovation equals change equals risk, therefore don't innovate. And I had heard in a number of the meetings, the investors and developers had just said they just want to build the product that they built last time because that's what got funded, because that's what is 98% occupied. In their mind, it was working because the building was occupied. What they weren't accounting for was what that experience was that was being delivered to the consumer, and even whether occupancy alone is the right gauge for success, or whether there are other metrics that can be considered in the success of the asset.
Right. Yeah. The innovation obviously wasn't a priority. It was more just sort of seeking that stability, but not doing so with blinders on. So I'm curious. Obviously, meetings 1 through 399, where you're seeking that capital. Some positives, but also some frustrations, but enough positives to keep you going. What was it on that 400th meeting that allowed you to finally get that yes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, although we weren't iterating in the real world because we couldn't launch a product to iterate on, what we were really doing with each of those meetings was getting a chance to iterate our pitch and iterate the theory behind the business model. And eventually we were able to get it to a point where we were able to answer all the questions that this risk-averse investor had of us. I also think it took some time for us to find the group that themselves were entrepreneurial thinkers, self-made, as opposed to an industry that tends to be more generational in its approach. And so wealth gets passed down, and the family business real estate business gets passed down from generation to generation, and no generation wants to be the one that screws it up. So there's a different thought around risk-taking, I think, for perhaps a business person who's self-made versus one who's looking to preserve wealth. I think that helped a lot, just the mindset of our partners. It also helped that the capital itself was Eastern European capital, and so the investors' risk was also a little bit skewed. The fact that they were investing in a U.S. market and a gateway city and a rental housing asset class itself was risk averse enough. It allowed them to venture a little further out on the risk curve because their perspective of just being in a stable country, in a stable city, in a stable asset class was risk averse enough.
Interesting, understood. So, I'm curious in your pitches, and maybe the 400th one that you got the yes on. How much did you bring in the story of the genesis of the idea with your brother in New York and the and the false wall and sort of the Craigslist ad, or was it very data intensive where you sort of said, look, this is the untapped market and this is what we're aiming to solve, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, at that point it was really a combination of the two, and what we were able to do was scrape the Craigslist data and segment it to show the price points that Craigslist market options in the rooms and shares section were transacting at, and to show also just the prevalence of activity on Craigslist. The idea that what we were doing, what we were proposing, was not creating new consumer behavior. The idea of roommating actually far more the norm now than the exception for an entire cohort of young professionals. We needed to be able to demonstrate in the data and anecdotally that this was a safe bet for an investor to take.
Right. So tell me a little bit. Obviously now you're renting out. You've got pent up demand, and people are moving into your buildings. What are some of the amenities you guys offer? Why are renters interested in this co-living concept? What are some of the benefits to kind of the traditional model?
Yeah. So the product itself, you can almost think of as a hybrid between an apartment building, a student housing situation, and a hotel. So it's got the leasing terms and the zoning of an apartment building. It's got the camaraderie and sense of community, but also the density that a dormitory has. And then it has the experience of a hotel. So the fact that it's a furnished unit, you're getting Wi-Fi and cable, housekeeping's provided on a weekly basis. The housekeepers are changing your bed linens. They're swapping out 2 fresh towels every week for you. They're restocking toilet paper.
Wow.
It's a very hospitality forward experience. So that the product is this hybrid of those 3 things. It all happens within smaller spaces. So what Ollie's job has been is to really show how these small spaces can be also highly livable. We use things like transforming furniture, where the bed becomes a sofa or a desk becomes a dining table. But then we also help our consumer understand how the idea of a living room is actually quite a misnomer. You don't go to your living room to live. You go to your living room to veg. And so what we've done is our community managers are helping to bring our residents out of the household unit itself and into the community, both the community and the broader building. We have 27,000 square feet of amenity space in our newest location, which is really fantastic. Beautifully designed, fun amenity space.
Yeah.
And we don't stop there. We think about the entire city as the living room as well. So we this past winter we did a snowshoeing and whiskey tasting event. We do paint and sip nights.
Cool.
And all sorts of, we do our organic farm tours, literally where you sit down at the end of the tour and have a farm-to-table lunch right there in the middle of an orchard. Those are the kind of events and experiences that we're organizing. To me, that's the true essence of a living room.
Yeah.
As opposed to a place where you go to veg.
And so, how do you guys go about? Are you involved in the sort of the pairing up of individuals? So if somebody goes and says, "I'm interested in this concept," how do I find someone that to share a living space with? Is there a method that people transact with you on that front?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the pain points we were looking to solve was to create a compatibility algorithm for roommating. And think about these dating sites. Dating sites have more considerations for compatibility today. But if you think about what dating is versus roommating, in the case of roommating, you're skipping dating and you're going right to living together. So it's even more important that you have an algorithm for roommating, I would think,
yeah,
for dating. So it was always part of our plan to create a roommate matching platform, which we've cheekily named Bedvetter.
Love the name.
This is our father's influence. We were always playing around with puns and all sorts of things like that. But for us, it was more important for us to have a roommate matching platform than even having a furnished unit. As important as the furniture is, your experience at Ollie is defined more by that household composition and how well you get along with your roommates than anything else.
Right.
In my brother's early experience, where he sublet his 2 spare bedrooms on Craigslist, he had 2 women who had shown up as complete strangers. And a couple years later, as he had become Facebook friends with them, and he had moved on himself, but a couple years later, he saw on one of their Facebook pages that one of them was getting married, and it turns out the other, who had shown up as a complete stranger, was the maid of honor in her wedding.
Wow, that's such a cool story.
We saw this opportunity not just to eliminate the negatives in the experience, but also double down on the positives that could come out of the experience, the human connection. And I do think in a lot of ways, the growing popularity of co-living is a reflection that all of this tech that's out there that was supposed to connect us to one another ended up just connecting us to our devices, or our devices to one another. The opportunity then was for co-living to connect humans back to one another as opposed to devices.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So what are some of the the factors that go into the matching on Bedvetter? How do you without getting too much in the weeds, what are some of the the things that people input that delivers the output of here's the ideal roommate for you?
Well, it really ranges from the very fun to the very functional and the more practical. On the practical side, it's just basic questions like, do you take your shoes off at the door? Are you smoker, non-smoker? Are you pet friendly? Those types of questions. And then on the fun side, we're asking people about their preferences and hobbies and interests and their music preferences, things like that can help foster a far deeper connection amongst the residents.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes a ton of sense. I always say, especially in relationships, right, that you don't truly know the person that you're in a relationship with until you live with them, and then all of a sudden you're having arguments about how the other person folds the towels and stuff like that. So I love that you mentioned just even things like, do you leave your shoes on or take them off at the door? Because it seems trivial, but those are the kind of things that end up, causing debates and fights between roommates. So I love that. That's such a cool insight into what the Bedvetter app does and how it sort of comes out on the other end with an ideal kind of roommate. So let's talk a little bit about what your typical customer looks like. The sort of what you've been describing, I'm very much envisioning the young urban professional, somebody probably in their 20s or so, and I would imagine that's probably a key demographic for you. But are there other demographics? I guess what does your typical customer look like that's taking part in an Ollie living space?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I typically guide people to not think about Ollie's consumer as an average age, because the average can be a little bit misleading. In fact, there tends to be a little more of a barbell when it comes to the demographics. where you have on the one end of the spectrum tends to be a 22 to say 35-year-old. On the other end of the spectrum is more of a baby boomer or empty nester. And then in between, you do see certain cohorts like long-distance commuters or recent divorcees. And so the psychographic, I think, is more important than the demographic itself. The demographic is the output, but the psychographic, that's who we're able to target. And the psychographic, conveniently, it also helps that thinking about things in psychographic terms keeps us out of trouble in the fair housing world. So it's very important to Ollie that we're creating a community that is all-inclusive. Ollie itself is a phonetic wordplay on all-inclusive, Ollie all-inclusive. And the idea there is, of course, that it's an all-inclusive hotel-style living experience, but all-inclusive for us is also a reference to the community itself.
Okay.
We segment the market along the lines of our 4 C's: cost savings, convenience, comfort, and community. And depending on which psychographic you follow, will determine which of those 4 C's matter more to you. So to a 22-year-old right out of college moving to the city without having a deep social network already in hand, community of those 4 C's is incredibly important. To someone who's a long-distance commuter looking for an easy in and out, easy access in and out, and ideally doesn't have to pack a bag every time they're on the road, can just leave a set of clothes in the second location, to have their bed made, their dishes done for them, things like that, and not have to worry about doing those things when they leave for the weekend. That really makes the convenience C the most important attribute. Depends on the psychographic, which of those 4 C's matter most.
Makes sense. So I'm curious. As you were talking through the different age ranges and walks of life and things like that, your consumers come from. I was picturing the snowshoeing and whiskey tasting event. Are you seeing equal representation between the young urban professional in their 20s and the empty nester and the recent divorcee and the long distance commuter? Are those events where you're sort of re-envisioning what the quote unquote living room looks like? Are they drawing the interest from all walks of life?
What we're really finding is, and I think this ties back to a broader trend in society just more generally, but we're absolutely seeing this. Age is just a number.
Right.
You are the age you feel. And so we have, one of the most rewarding things for me to see is when we have older residents interacting with younger residents. They don't care. I mean, if they're at an event, there was something about the event that appealed to them, that's a common bond that they share. They both felt like this event was one they wanted to RSVP to. They both decided to show up, whether that was whiskey tasting and snowshoeing or painting by numbers or a Broadway show. We have a pretty broad range of events. And so if our residents are showing up together at those events, they already share something in common. And that's enough.
Right. Well, I'd love to get an invite to one of those events. It sounds really cool. I don't think we'd be able to quite do the snowshoeing in London, but I love the vision of it. It just sounds like such a cool event. So, what would you say, as a business, is your ultimate goal? I mean, I'd love you. Yeah, I think you've touched on a lot of it, but I mean, obviously, you guys want to succeed as a business and pay off the trust of your investors and things like that I think all businesses want. But just in terms of social impact and making an impact in the community, what are some of your goals and how do you see the concept growing?
Yeah, the really nice thing about our business model is we don't feel like we have to choose between economic impact and social impact. To us, the two are going hand in hand. We've created a better mousetrap that also drives a better return to the investor, but that better mousetrap is built around the humanization of housing. So our deeper mission, what motivates our team to come in day out and spend nights and weekends pouring themselves into this, is that our mission has a social good attached to it, which is really this idea of humanizing housing. And we've even thought about that far more tangibly. I know it sounds kind of like this lofty, highfalutin idea of humanizing housing, but for us it actually means something very tangible, and every member of the team understands what their role in the humanization of housing is. So we've mapped it out using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we've thought about the base of the pyramid being the fairly basic needs of shelter and water. And those are things, by the way, that the existing housing market does fairly well. If you can afford the official housing market, there's a good chance your roof is going to stay standing and that your plumbing is going to continue to work. Where the existing housing market falls short, especially for those who can't afford it, but it also falls short in the more emotional or psychological needs of the pyramid. Essentially landlords are very focused on getting that lease signed with you, getting that documentation in place, and there's a lot of fine print in there, and then they hand you the keys, and then you're left to your own devices. And so we go for years in these buildings, oftentimes, without even knowing the basics or even the name of our next door neighbor. It's no wonder that there's this loneliness epidemic. So at Ollie, we view a big part of our job is creating a sense of belonging, which is that next rung on Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Building the esteem of our residents. There's a lot of ways that we think about building esteem, not the least of which is designing spaces very purposefully and very functionally for residents. Even though these are small, dense spaces, they feel really beautiful and look beautiful, and they feel very functional. So really embedding a sense of esteem with our residents. And then the notion of self-actualization. That's the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The idea of self-actualization, though, is an interesting one. I don't feel that I can or Ollie can self-actualize anybody for them. Like, the word self is in there for a reason, and they've got to do that work on their own. However, Ollie can look at what the obstacles, and any business really can do this, can look at what the obstacles to self-actualization are. And it's typically time or money. I don't have enough time to pursue my passion, or I don't make enough money to pursue my passion. So by embedding a sense of hospitality, we're returning hours every week to our residents' lives, and by being focused on the efficiency of their space so that they're not paying for more space than they need or more space than they value, we can return dollars back to them. So now they have both the time and the money to pursue their passion, whatever their calling or interest may be.
I love that you're taking me back to my sociology and psychology courses in college with the hierarchy of needs. But I sort of say that lightly, but I love what you said. It's so true that you don't necessarily have to separate economic impact with social impact. And in a way, and I think you were alluding to this, they're very well connected, right? When you sort of get more into sort of satisfying those very human needs, there's more of a, for lack of a better term, there's more stickiness to it, right? They want to stay in your properties because that you're filling those more sort of soft, if you want to call it, intangible needs. So I love that you touched on that. It's a really, really good point, and I think it helps our listeners kind of understand why it's such a powerful business model that you guys have. Are there any plans for? What cities in the U.S. are your properties right now, or what cities are you looking at?
Yeah, so our third location opened in 2018, and that was in Long Island City in New York. Our first location was a Manhattan location, so also New York. Our second location that we had opened is in Pittsburgh. And I like that we were able to show a very wide range from Pittsburgh to New York. Pittsburgh's not considered a gateway city like New York, but it does have a lot of really wonderful things to offer. Housing affordability is not a particular pain point in Pittsburgh in the same way that it is in a lot of the other gateway cities, but the desire for convenience and comfort and community and those things are not any different. And so we knew we had an opportunity to come into more cities than just the gateway cities, and opening in Pittsburgh allowed us to demonstrate the depth of demand for this style of living in such markets. That means now we also have cities like Denver on the list. We've got Miami coming. We've got Boston is in the pipeline. Los Angeles is in the pipeline, and other New York City locations as well. And now we're starting to see opportunities outside of the U.S., so in some of the international markets, as well as the cities that you'd expect, like the San Franciscos and
Sure.
Other Chicago's and other larger cities.
How about potential challenges down the road that you're keeping your eye on in terms of this concept? I mean, obviously, it sounds like you've really kind of nailed the need in the market on more on a tangible and intangible level. But what are some of the things that you're kind of keeping your eye on and thinking about as potential barriers to growth and how you overcome them?
Yeah, it's funny. We went from needing 400 meetings to get our first ES and our first location to now it's not unusual for us to get 2 or 3, sometimes more opportunities inbounded to us in a single afternoon. So the opportunity and the challenge is just simply keeping pace, making sure that we're adding bandwidth appropriately within the organization to keep pace with the demand from landlords and from institutional capital. Our pipeline, to give you an idea, we started this year with about 50 or so, a little over 50 projects that we were negotiating or evaluating, in addition to the 3 that were open and the 5 that were already signed up under development. And that 50 or so has now ballooned to, I think we're around 115 just a few months into the year. A lot of those these are large-scale projects. Ollie's angle within the co-living space has been to focus on institutional-grade, large-scale opportunities, so 250 beds or more per location. That's a lot of capital needed to construct these assets. So if you look at the 115 or so projects in our pipeline, and you think about the total amount of dollars necessary to bring all of those projects to market, it amounts to over $10 billion of capital.
Wow.
Which is certainly a lot.
Yeah.
And if you think about the amount of supply that $10 billion will bring, it's roughly 30,000 beds. And 30,000 beds sounds like a lot, but when it's put into the context of this addressable market in the U.S. alone being closer to about 18 million beds, 30,000 beds at $10 billion is not but a drop in the bucket to the addressable need in the market. So the challenge and the opportunity is for Ollie to figure out the best, most programmatic, most efficient way to connect the capital markets into this product type. Because it won't disrupt the same way that co-working disrupted, which was able to just slot into existing assets. It really does depend much more heavily on creating new supply of housing and therefore new construction projects in order to fully optimize the living experience and disrupt the housing market to its full potential.
Yeah, I mean, it just really, like you were saying earlier, it's needing to sort of to innovate and rethink what has historically been a very kind of stubborn, change-resistant industry.
We're there finally, and I think the track record of our newest location, which is co-located alongside conventional apartments, we've been able to demonstrate that we're leasing up at the same pace, if not faster, than the conventional apartments, and that we're also generating a 30% higher income per square foot. And we've been able to set up the floor plans as well so that they're readily convertible back to conventional layouts if for whatever reason something happened and this strategy ended up no longer being in vogue. So we've been able to address both the risk side of the equation and the reward side together to hopefully set the stage for much bigger amounts of institutional capital to be unlocked into the sector.
Do you ever have any sort of tongue-in-cheek outreach to some of those early investors that you met with in meetings 1 through 399 and sort of, I think there's always that temptation to have the "I told you so" conversation, but maybe they're coming to you and say, you were right and we should have gotten in on the ground. But I'm just wondering if those conversations have happened since you guys have obviously demonstrated what you were pitching in those meetings.
During the course of those meetings, it was difficult to hear. It was difficult to not come out of those meetings with a yes, because I believed so deeply in what we were doing. In hindsight, I really should be sending a thank you letter to every one of those. That all of those investors or developers were willing to take an hour of their time to meet with me, and it was their feedback, even if I didn't want to hear it at the time, it was their feedback that helped inform a business model that could address this rather risk-averse mindset in an industry. And now I think about Ollie is not disrupting the industry from the outside in, but really because of the feedback we had been able to conjure up along the way from so many groups willing to spend the time with us, we're essentially helping the industry disrupt itself from within.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Before we kind of wrap up, what we love to do with our guests on our podcast is have a little bit of fun at the end of the interview, and we play a little word association game. We call it Word Bridge, which is a little play on our company name, Third Bridge. So a shout out to people like your dad who love the puns. So I'm just going to throw out a word or a phrase, and first thing that comes to mind, doesn't have to be a one-word answer, but just first thing that comes to mind. Pet peeve.
Smoking.
Okay. So we know you wouldn't be seeking a roommate that smokes, obviously.
Yeah, I'm giving away my roommate profile here.
Bedroom.
Clean.
Okay. Rent.
High.
Yeah. And then lastly, a buzzword that's I think sort of is either controversial or not, but millennial.
Opportunity.
Great. And then another thing that we like to do is just is give our listeners a little insight, to founders of these really interesting companies. What's the first thing you do when you get to the office each day?
Drink a Diet Dr. Pepper.
Really? Okay. I would not have predicted that.
Yeah, it's my vice and my source of caffeine in the morning.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, most people I think love the coffee, and so that's your caffeine and your vice. I love it. Well, thanks, Chris. Like I said, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think our listeners will too. And so I appreciate you taking the time with us. Where can our listeners go to find out more about Ollie and your properties?
We'd love to have them come on to ollie.co, and they can reach out to us via one of the forum pages on ollie.co.
Great. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate your time, and we'll be talking soon.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Bye.